It's pretty fancy. So please follow along as I read the scriptures from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 6, and John 20, verses 1 through 18. For I handed on to you as of first importance what I in turn have received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. And then from the book of John, early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where he laid them." Then Peter and the other disciple set out and went toward the tomb. The two were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent down to look in and saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb. He saw the linen wrappings lying there, and the cloth that had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen wrappings, but rolled up in a place by itself. Then the other disciple, who reached the tomb first, also went in, and he saw and believed, for as yet they did not understand the scripture, that he must rise from the dead. Then the disciples returned to their homes, but Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb, and she saw two angels in white, sitting where the body of Jesus had been lying, one at the head and the other at the feet. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." When she had said this, she turned round and saw Jesus standing there. But she did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? For whom are you looking?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Hebrew, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said to her, "Do not hold on to me, because I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her. Herein ends the readings.
Ooh. Our topic today is a difficult one, the resurrection. Now, Pastor Mike asked me to share his sermon today, and it will complete the 5-part sermon series on reasons for God. I was told I could revise or add to it to make it my own, but I want to deliver the sermon that Mike prepared. And so my only addition is to frame it with a couple of questions. The first one is, do you believe our existence is simply a matter of mind and body, or do you believe that it is mind, body, and spirit? In other words, are we just mind and body, or mind, body, and spirit? And on top of that, in our modern scientific world, what is your view of miracles? Here we have a quote from Leo Tolstoy, and we'll read it together. What will come of what I am doing today or tomorrow? What will come of my whole life? Why should I live? Why wish for anything or do anything? Is there any meaning in my life that the inevitable death awaiting me does not destroy? So we begin with this quote about, is there any meaning in life? And any meaning to anything I do that inevitable death will not destroy. Well, here's a perspective on the resurrection from Pastor Mike. He says, when I prepare a sermon, I use scientific tools of modern scientific research, historical research that any professor at a state university religion department would use. In part, that means when it comes to the resurrection, as historians, they have a big problem with people being raised from the dead. Their philosophical assumption is that miracles simply don't happen. So they try to reconstruct historical events with that bias in mind. It doesn't help that the New Testament accounts of Jesus' resurrection are contradictory in their details. Go ahead, read through the final chapters of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, where Jesus' resurrection is described. Make a list of all the things that happened in the four Gospels and compare them. Jot down the similarities and the differences. And once you see these accounts side by side, there are differences all over the place. The accounts don't agree about who went to the tomb on the third day, about what they saw when they were there, what they were told when they arrived at the tomb, and what they did when they were asked to do something. All these things are different in the Gospels, and they're very difficult to reconcile. Even apart from the discrepancies, though, the event of the resurrection itself is a problem for historians. Not because historians are atheists who don't believe in miracles, but the reality is historians have a hard time establishing the occurrence of miracles in the past. Historians, by their very nature, can only establish what probably happened. That's what historians do. They determine if something is highly probable, fairly probable, possible, or improbable. They must rank things according to levels of certitude and probability. Historians can never prove what happened in the past, because the past has already happened. It's over and done with, and there is no video. So they can only establish what probably happened, and some things are more probable than others. Miracles, by their very definition, are highly improbable. If they weren't highly improbable, they wouldn't be miracles. So we might talk about a miracle as something that happens that violates what normally happens in nature. Some prefer to use the term unknown normal instead of paranormal to describe these phenomena that we would call miracles. But let's get real. Einstein claimed that we only understand 2% of how the universe works. So imagine all of the things that we don't understand about that other 98%. Nevertheless, there are some things that we say are normal occurrences and some things that aren't. For instance, if one of you were able to go out on the surf break at El Porto and walk out on the water without sinking, we'd call it a miracle, right? I mean, that kind of thing just doesn't happen. There are billions of people in the world, and do you think anyone could go out and walk on the water? If someone did it, that would be a miracle. It would be a violation of what normally happens in nature. And historians have a hard time establishing that a miracle happened in the past because they are so unlikely. Miracles are so unlikely. Historians can only establish what would likely have happened. So, the resurrection of Jesus is a miracle, yet historians can't prove that it happened. They can't demonstrate it. They can't show that it's highly probable because it's a miracle. And by definition, it's highly improbable. So, historians can't say exactly what happened with Jesus after his death, whether he was raised from the dead or not. However, stay with me now. What historians can say, though, with some certainty, is that some of Jesus' followers who came to believe that he had been raised from the dead, they really believed that. Fortunately, we're not restricted by our faith to scientific tools alone, modern historical research. And that's a good thing in part, because if we disbelieved the resurrection, we'd have a big difficulty explaining how the Christian church came to be at all, how the Christian church got started. Most people think that when it comes to Jesus' resurrection, the burden of proof is on Christians to prove that it happened, to show evidence that there was a resurrection. However, that's not the right question. Christians can't prove the miracle of the resurrection. The right question is quite different. Because if you believe that Jesus didn't raise him, if he was not raised from the dead, you have to come up with an alternative explanation for the birth of the church. And as you might imagine, many attempts have tried to do so. Some explain Christian beginnings this way. Early Christians, having a limited scientific understanding, could have easily fallen prey to the reports of a risen Christ. Because they were brokenhearted when Jesus was killed, and they already believed in supernatural things. Since they believed that Jesus was the Messiah, they might have begun to sense that he was still with them, guiding them and living on in their hearts. Over the decades, these feelings of Jesus living on spiritually developed into stories that he had been raised physically. The resurrection accounts of the four Gospels were devised to bolster this belief. Sounds plausible, right? But what happens when we learn about the historical and cultural context of the time? In other words, what's wrong with this alternate explanation of the birth of the church? Was it all a ruse that fooled a lot of people? Timothy Keller identifies 3 difficulties with this alternate account. The first difficulty is the claim that the empty tomb and eyewitnesses were fabrications. This can't be true. The fabrication account just doesn't hold water. Here's why. The first accounts of the empty tomb were found in Paul's letters, which every historian agrees were written some 15 to 20 years after the death of Jesus. By the way, if this is of interest to you, you'll enjoy Richard Bauckham's book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, the Gospels as Eyewitness Testimony. According to Bauckham, recent anthropological studies show that ancient cultures clearly distinguished between historical tales and historical facts, historical accounts, tales and accounts. Historical accounts, like the empty tomb, were regarded as truthful accounts of the past. This is what he says on page 272. Here's the thing. Eyewitnesses of the empty tomb and the resurrection of Jesus were still alive during the time that Paul wrote about them. The Oral Society that preserved these accounts treated them as historical accounts, not as historical tales, which means they were preserved more faithfully. So, when Paul recorded this oral history, when he took it all intact as he essentially had been told, he was inviting people who doubted that Jesus had appeared after his death to go and talk to the eyewitnesses. Paul could not have made such a challenge if the eyewitnesses did not exist. Granted, there were discrepancies in the biblical accounts, which makes sense, but the essence of the story remains the same. Further support for the claim about the empty tomb and eyewitnesses, or not fabrication, lies in the witnesses themselves. Each gospel states that the first eyewitnesses to the resurrection were women, right? Well, women's low social status at the time meant that their testimony wasn't admissible in court. Why would the church fabricate a story and use women as the first witnesses? That would have undermined the credibility of their story. Why would the church fabricate that story? That would have undermined everything. A convincing fabrication would have to do better than that. The only reasonable explanation for why women were depicted as meeting the resurrected Jesus first is if they had. Paul's letters show that Christians proclaimed Jesus' bodily resurrection from the very beginning. That means that the tomb must have been empty. Otherwise, skeptics could have easily produced Jesus' corpse to disprove it. Likewise, hundreds of witnesses who've claimed that they saw him in resurrected form, because Paul couldn't have gotten away with telling people in a public document that there were scores of witnesses alive if there weren't. People would try to verify it, and I'm sure they did. The second difficulty is the assumption that belief in individual bodily resurrection was the dominant worldview at the time, in the first century. The truth is, belief in an individual bodily resurrection was almost inconceivable at that time. According to N.T. Wright, the universal view of people at that time was that a bodily resurrection was impossible. If this subject intrigues you, you'll be happy to read N.T. Wright's book called The Resurrection of the Son of God. So in Greco-Roman thinking, no soul, having been freed from its body, would ever want it back. Even those who believed in reincarnation understood that the return to the body was not, the soul was not yet out of its prison. The goal was to get free of the body forever. That's what they thought. So the report of Jesus' resurrection would have been unthinkable to a Greek. Likewise, if someone said to a first century Jew, so-and-so was resurrected from the dead, the response would be, "Are you crazy?" The very idea of an individual resurrection would have been impossible to imagine to a Jew as to a Greek. The third difficulty is the idea that the resurrection-centered view of reality had been evolving slowly over time, and it just happened to coincide with Jesus' resurrection. The Christian view of the resurrection actually sprang full-blown immediately after the death of Jesus. There was no process or development. The idea of a bodily resurrection was unprecedented in prior history. It ordinarily takes years of debate and discussion for such a shift in massive thinking to evolve into a worldview level. This wasn't human evolution of thought. Jesus' followers said that their beliefs didn't come from debating and discussing. They were simply testifying to what they had seen. N.T. Wright reminds us that Jews believed in a single, transcendent, personal God. It was blasphemy for a Jew that any human being should be worshipped. Yet hundreds of Jews began worshiping Jesus literally overnight. How do you explain that unless you believe they had seen him resurrected? That would certainly change their mind, wouldn't it? Furthermore, let's keep in mind that virtually all the apostles and early Christian leaders died for their faith. It's hard to believe that this kind of powerful self-sacrifice would have been done to carry out a hoax. So, If you're a skeptic, how do you answer these historical questions? Why did Christianity emerge so rapidly with such power? No other band of messianic leaders in that era concluded that their leader had been raised from the dead. Why did this group decide to do so? No group of Jews worshiped a human being as God. What led these Jews to do that? What changed their worldview virtually overnight? How can you account for the hundreds of eyewitnesses to the resurrection who lived on for decades and publicly maintained their testimony, eventually giving their lives for that belief? Nothing in history can be proven the way scientists prove something in a lab. However, every effort to account for the birth of the church, apart from Jesus' resurrection, presents difficulties based on what we know about first century culture and history. Think about this. First century people found the resurrection as inconceivable as you and I. The only way anyone embraced the resurrection back then was by letting the evidence challenge and change their worldview. Eyewitness accounts and the changed lives of Christian followers followed first century people overwhelming evidence, and the same is true for you and me today. Remember the story of Paul? He was a persecutor of those Christian sects until he had the experience on the road to Damascus. If you and I had the same experience to see the risen Christ bodily in front of us, that would be a little bit of a change, wouldn't it? I mean, most of us care deeply about justice, right? You want to alleviate hunger and disease, right? You care about the environment. The message of the resurrection is a message of good news for the whole world. Jesus' life, death, and resurrection were all about restoring justice to the oppressed and marginalized, restoring physical wholeness to the diseased and dying, restoring community to the isolated and lonely, restoring spiritual joy and connection to those alienated from God. It could be that this 5-part sermon series has left some of you wishing that you had more faith than you do. If that's the case, let me encourage you with this thought. You don't have to wait. You don't have to wait for all your doubts and fears to go away. Take hold of Christ. And may I suggest the simple prayer, God, come and find me. Amen.